Hi everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Levi Cosijn, and today for you I have Anthony Lewis. Anthony Lewis is an American astrologer, researcher, has been into astrology since the 80s. He's a retired psychiatrist. He also has a major in mathematics. He's not a practicing astrologer. I mean, he does horoscopes for his friends and close ones, but he doesn't really do consultations, but he's definitely someone who has a lot of experience, and this is our fourth interview. And so welcome, Anthony.
Okay, great to see you again.
Great to see you. Today we're going to talk about Horary Astrology. So because I know you have written a book on Horary Astrology, I think, I don't know, when was it, in the 80s or the 90s?
I wrote it in the late 80s. It came out, I think, around 1990, the first edition. Then the editor published a second edition, slightly revised, a few years later in the early 90s.
All right. So we discussed and agreed to examine a horary example. But first, can you tell us what horary astrology is and how you came about it? Because you wrote a book about it. So
okay. Well, horary is one of the major branches of astrology, and basically it has to do with answering questions based on the moment that the client asks the astrologer the question. I think it came about because early on in the history of astrology, it was rare that people actually knew their birth times or even their birth dates in some cases, but they would still want to consult astrologers. You know, if you were born into royalty, probably you would know your birth date and time, because the court doctor, physician, or astrologer would note everything. If you were an ordinary person, nobody might really remember what time you were born, or you might not know it. But so if you went to consult an astrologer, they had this dilemma, because they had techniques that they could use to answer your question, but most of the initial techniques were based on the birth time, which gave you a specific point of the zodiac rising on the horizon. You know, the Greeks called the horoscopus, or we call it the ascendant.
Yes, exactly.
And I think in Vedic it's also crucial to have that degree, because it really determines a lot about, in the natal chart, the character of the person and his path in life. If you don't know the birth time, then you have to construct a chart for a different time that's relevant to the question. And I think there's a passage in Dorotheus, he's one of the early Hellenistic astrologers, where he's discussing, someone comes to see him, I think as a slave owner, and his slave has run away. And he wants to know what happened to the slave, will I get him back? And so Dorotheus talks about, what chart do we use to answer this? And he says there are three possibilities. One is, if you know the specific moment, you can cast a chart for the event itself. You know, I know the slave ran away Tuesday at 5 p.m. And then you study that chart and try to figure out what happened to the slave. But then he says, suppose nobody really knows when the slave ran away, but they discovered he ran away and then informed the owner. And Dorotheus, well, you can use that time, the time you got news of the event. If no one actually witnessed the event, but you know it happened, the time you got news of the event, that's a second possible chart that's related to the event itself. So the first chart is the event itself. The second is when you received the news that it happened. And then he says, well, if you don't remember that time, then the third relevant time is the time you went to the astrologer to find out what happened. And you told the astrologer, tell me what happened to my slave. And that's a key moment. So he says there's these three kind of key moments you can use. The moment of the event, the moment you got news of the event, and those are two event charts, or the moment you ask the astrologer, tell me what happened to my slave. And that's the horary chart. Horary, it comes from the Latin word hora, meaning hour.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's the hour or moment of the question. And so the theory is this is a relevant moment because it's the moment of the meeting of two minds. The person who asked the question, called in the English literature the querent, the person who
Yes.
queries, and the astrologer who is going to try to answer the question based on the positions of planets in the heavens at that moment. And so based on this, there's a whole series of techniques that developed to answer the question. And the techniques are based on what we all know about astrology. There are signs, there are planets, there are houses, they have certain symbolism, they have certain relations to each other. And
Mm-hmm.
so if we study the pattern of the chart, the symbolism of the chart, we should be able to say something meaningful about what happened and what's likely to happen in the future, and also what happened in the recent past. Okay.
Right. Is that, I know William Lilly wrote a lot about horary.
Mm-hmm.
Has that been your entrance to Horary astrology, or where did you start?
I've been interested in astrology since I was 11 years old. I think I told you this before.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was a teenager, and I grew up in a small town in Connecticut, there was very little available on astrology. There were a couple of books in the library. And in the stores, there was a magazine called Dell Horoscope magazine. I think they still publish it. It was a monthly magazine, and I used to buy a copy periodically and read it.
Mm-hmm.
And I once read an article in there about horary, and I thought, this is weird, this is strange, and it can't work. Because how can you ask a question, do a chart, and get an answer? It made no sense to me. But in this same magazine, and this is in my mid to late teens, there was once an ad. There was an astrologer in Brooklyn who was teaching a course on horary astrology. And he was looking for questions for his students to use. And so he said, if you send me a question, my students will answer it in the class and we'll send you a response. So I think I was a senior in high school, and I was applying for this scholarship to go to the university. And I was really concerned, will I get this scholarship or not? It was important to me. So I sent this letter, will I get this scholarship? And it was actually maybe 6 or 8 weeks later, I got a response. There was my note, will I get the scholarship? And under it was written, N-O, no. They didn't have any explanation. They just said no.
Right.
And by then, I'd already heard that I did not get the scholarship. So it was a correct answer.
Mm-hmm.
But I sort of dismissed it. I said, well, they had a 50-50 chance of getting it right.
Sure.
So maybe it was just a lucky guess. Maybe they flipped a coin, and I sort of dismissed it. But it still was in the back of my mind, well, they'd got it right anyway. I mean, so who knows? And then I think sometime after that, maybe my early 20s, because I would like to read about astrology. I was in a bookstore and found this book, which was a reprint of an abbreviated version of William Lilly,
Mm-hmm.
which had been around since, I think, the mid-1800s, and they kept republishing it. So this is about the 1960s. So I bought it, and I read it, and it made no sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
It had all this terminology, and it was like gobbledygook, and I thought, this makes no sense. So I didn't really understand it. I had the book, I put it aside.
But you also, you mentioned you are a psychiatrist, so you were studying classical, medicine. I can
Right.
imagine that, astrology is not really part of that universe, I mean,
No.
especially
No.
that those days.
No, the astrology has always been a serious hobby. My serious study was medicine. And so I put that book aside, and what finally happened in the 80s, I joined this group in Connecticut where I live. There's a very good astrology group, the Astrological Society of Connecticut. And they had monthly lectures, and I would start going to those. They were quite fascinating. And I met people there who did horary. And they were convinced it worked. And then this friend of mine had an important question and heard that I did some horary. I mean, I really didn't, but she asked me to look at her question. So I got out my abridged version of Lily, and I looked up how to analyze this chart, and I gave her an answer, and it was accurate, and it was eerily accurate. Her question, this was a serious question. She was pregnant. She was a few months into the pregnancy. She felt like something wasn't right. She went to her doctor the week before. The doctor said everything's fine, but she said that it doesn't feel fine to me. Look at the chart. I got out Lily. I looked up the relevant pages because there's techniques for everything. I did the chart, and it was completely negative. And as far as I could understand Lily, it meant the baby or the fetus wasn't going to make it. Mm-hmm. And for me, this was a dilemma because this was my friend. I really didn't feel like I knew what I was doing, so I didn't know what to say to her. So I think I just said something like, I don't understand this. Mm-hmm. I don't see a lot of positive things. It looks a little negative, but ignore that because I'm a novice and I have no idea what I'm doing. But then she went to the doctor a few days later and she had a miscarriage. Mm. And it was exactly as Lily had said. Even the timing was accurate. You can do timing in horary when some things are likely to happen. Yes. And it happened on the day that the chart had indicated it might happen. And that totally freaked me out. Mm-hmm. So I put Lily aside for, I think, 6 or 8 months and didn't do any more horary charts after that.
I just want to say something about that, Anthony, because here we clearly see one of the issues with horary is how invested is the person asking the question.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is, in my experience, is so crucial in the way a horary plays out. I mean, not in the sense that, the result is going to be a yes or a no or something like that, but how meaningful it is to the person. Exactly. Because when you ask your question, for your scholarship, I can, imagine it must have been very invested. Maybe
I wanted to go to university. I didn't come from a family with much resources, so I really needed scholarships if I was going to attend university. It was important to me. Yeah.
Yeah. So there is something.
I got a different scholarship, fortunately.
But yeah.
But the one I asked about, I didn't get.
Right. But you were invested, and that's the whole thing. It's so important to have that emotional fire burning when asking a question.
Yeah, that's very clear in the literature. I think Bonatti writes about it. He's a 12th or 13th century Italian, and he says it has to be something of really burning, urgent personal concern. Yeah. And what he said to his clients when they would come to him, he said, now, how long you've been worried about this? And if they hadn't been concerned and trying to answer it on their own for at least 24 hours, he would say, come back to me in a day, think about it, pray on it, do what you can to try to answer it. And if you still can't answer it, then come back to see me, because he regarded it as a kind of sacred moment. You're asking the universe, or whatever you believe to be the Godhead of the universe, to intervene and give you an answer. Like it's called divination for that reason. You're asking the divine nature of the universe to step in and help you out in this situation. Now, if you look, there are a bunch of horary astrology groups on the internet. And if you read the questions, I'm going to be a little critical here. Some of them are really dumb. Like, I haven't heard from my boyfriend in 2 days. When will he call me? Like, it's like, is that really urgent? Would you bother divinity about that? I mean, would you?
Exactly.
Or I'm going to buy a new car. What color car should I buy? It's a stupid question.
Also, I'm coming from the Tajika angle with this. I studied some, and we discussed this before. I mean, Tajika Nilakanti gives also some, planetary placements to verify whether the client is actually, coming from an honest place. And so, I mean, and often it really works also, but you can just hear it in the question, most people just hear it in the question and the way the question is being asked. But when it's urgent, it's,
and my experience has been that when the question really matters, the chart is usually very clear.
Yes.
I mean, it doesn't have to be life-shattering, but it has to be something of importance and something you really can't answer on your own.
Exactly.
On the other hand, when you're learning, and I did this too, you ask any kind of question you can to see what the chart looks like. And some of them are going to produce silly charts that are meaningless because the question is silly. But if it's a really important question, like I had another experience, there was an astrologer I used to correspond with. This was years ago. Suddenly I stopped hearing from her. And I thought that was really odd. This was probably in the 80s, the late 80s, so sort of almost pre-internet days. And so we would correspond about charts and things. And I wrote her an email or something I didn't hear, and I thought that's strange. So I thought, well, maybe she didn't get it. I wrote again, I didn't hear. And so I did a chart because I was getting concerned. And the chart was very negative, and it looked like, frankly, she had died. And then I found out later from a colleague that she had died, that she had had breast cancer, and it was terminal. She went to the hospital and died of it. And that also freaked me out a bit because the chart was very clear, very negative. And so things like that. When it's important, when the matter's important, it's the most helpful. If you just have a trivial question, you're going to get a trivial chart, and it's going to be hard to interpret, and you're going to be left you wondering what the hell does this mean.
Exactly. Also, do you look at it for yourself? That's also one of these subtleties.
But the problem is if something really matters to you. It's really I find personally it's hard to be objective. Either way, if you see like a nice Jupiter Venus thing going on, that's great. Or if you see Saturn Mars, you think, oh shit, this is gonna. But you sort of overinterpret in one direction or the other depending on what you're worried about. It's much better if you have a really pressing question to ask someone else to look at it for you.
I agree. Yeah.
But you can do it for yourself. It's just I think it's much harder.
Yeah, I think if you're really true with the question and you can have some emotional distance observing the whole chart, it will give you that some insight. But I think
but the hard part is having the emotional distance if it's your question.
Yes. Okay, cool. I will let you present your example and then ask you some questions as we go.
Okay. There's a Horary Astrology group I go to on Facebook. Is that right? Yeah. And people post questions. They give their interpretation of the chart and they ask for feedback. And there was one last week that was interesting. Not an earth-shattering one, but an interesting one. Had nice symbolism, sort of a fun one. So I thought this would be good to look at because it's fun.
Cool. Yeah, great.
I want to start by saying Horary relies a lot on dignities of planets. This is the scheme I use. It's from Dorotheus, the Egyptian scheme. The dignities are important because when planets are dignified, they tend to behave well and be helpful. And when they're not dignified, they tend to behave badly and not be helpful. And so I don't want to go over this in a lot of detail, but planets can rule a sign where they're very dignified. They can be exalted where they're very dignified. They can rule the triplicity, like the fire signs, the earth signs, the air signs, the water signs. Then each sign is divided into 5 parts, and each non-luminary planet rules one of those parts. That's a dignity. And finally, the least dignity is the decans or faces. And then there are 2 particular debilities. One is the detriment, which is opposite the sign that it rules, and the other is the fall, which is opposite the sign where it's exalted. Detriment is an opposition. It's a sign opposite, and oppositions can be difficult. That's the idea. Here's the chart. This isn't my chart. This is the astrologer. His name is, I don't know how to pronounce it correctly, Lyubin Meshikov. He's from Bulgaria. He posted this chart. And the question was asked on August 21st, so it's recent, in Bulgaria. He lives near Razgrad, Bulgaria. And here's the question. And the point he was making, he was using anti-science, which is an interest of mine. So I thought this is what caught my attention. A woman approached me with the question, where are my earbuds? Now, this doesn't seem earth-shattering, but it was important to her. As she explained, she went to the gym, went home, couldn't find the earbuds. She was pretty certain she'd taken them home with her from the gym, but not 100% certain. And what mattered was she had borrowed them from her daughter, so they weren't even hers, and she didn't want to have lost her daughter's earbuds. And she apparently had searched everywhere, couldn't find them, and thought, I better ask my astrologer what happened. So there's a certain amount of urgency and personal importance to this. Finding lost objects is a very enjoyable way to use horary. When you've searched everywhere and really can't find something, and then you do a chart, often it will lead you to the lost object. And what's nice about that is you're either right or you're wrong, and you get clear evidence that you've analyzed the chart correctly. But so here, again, this is sort of a typical horary. Most people don't have these earth-shattering horaries. But this one, it's a valid one. She looked and looked, couldn't find them. It's important to her. She wants to give them back to her daughter, and she doesn't know what else to do. So she's going to ask the universe, help me find my earbuds.
Or it's praying to Saint Anthony, I think, or it's going to your astrologer, right?
My name is Anthony, but I'm no saint. Okay, so I cast the chart. I don't remember which house system he used originally. I had my software set for Lily Regiomontanus because that's what Lily used. So I just had it came up automatically here. Where are the earbuds? Here's what the chart looked like. It's for the astrologer's location because the astrologer is the one working on the chart. Some people do it differently, and they do it for the location of the person asking the question, because often you get questions over the internet these days. But Lily used his location. I used my location. And my rationale is, well, since I'm the one who's consulting the universe for the quadrant, then it's really how I'm looking at things. So I'm going to use my location. But people can do it differently, and there are people who swear by the other method. So the general rule of thumb is that the person who asked the question is represented by the ascendant, which is about almost 4 degrees of Libra here, 338 or 9. And so the symbolism of that degree and the planet ruling that degree, which is Venus, should have something to do with the quadrant. And it represents the woman who lost the earbuds is represented by Venus. The astrologer, interestingly, is the person she consults is the 7th house person, would be the Mars. That's not too relevant here, but just as a point of interest. Now, since she lost an object, a possession, according to Lilly and his reading of the ancient texts, possessions are ruled by the 2nd house. And also buried treasure is ruled by the 4th house. Things that you treasure that are somehow hidden are 4th house matters. So we would look at the 2nd and 4th house. And I'm going to move on from this in a minute. And what else will we look at? Oh, you always look at the moon.
All right.
And this column here just shows the dignities and strengths of the planets. The P stands for peregrine, which means there's no essential dignity. It's on, the question was asked on a Mercury day, which is Wednesday, and it was asked during a Saturn hour. And this is one of the criteria that Bonatti used to see if the question was really valid. That the person, the theory is, you don't just randomly ask a question. The hour that you ask a question should be relevant to the question. So Saturn is the hour. For some reason, when Saturn took over the hour of the day, the person thought, I better ask the question to the astrologer. Well, Saturn is a planet, one that has to do with loss.
Yeah.
And it has a relationship to the ascendant because Saturn is exalted in Libra. Saturn is one of the triplicity rulers of the air signs. So there's a connection to the ascendant. So let me move on.
And it was also ruling the fourth house there, which was one of the houses that you...
Right, yeah. This is just repeating what I said. This is the data. It's a Mercury day, Saturn hour. The ascendant means that Venus rules the quadrant. Oh, what I like to do, and this is a technique from the Persian astrologers, they looked at the 12th part or dwad of the ascendant.
Yes.
And they looked at the sign and its ruler to get a sense of what's on the querent's mind, because this is how you would do it in a Hindu method. And I generally look at both a quadrant house system and a whole sign system to see if one gives me a better fix than the other. And I
me too, for sure.
Combine the two meanings.
Yeah.
So if we look at this, the dwad of 3 Libra is somewhere in Scorpio. I didn't calculate it exactly. So Scorpio is on the querent's mind, and Mars is on the querent's mind. Scorpio is her possessions. Makes sense. Mars is here in Virgo in the 12th. The 12th could be loss. So definitely. A lost possession. Mars rules the 7th. So the 7th has to do with other people generally, and specifically in horary, it can represent a thief. So she may be thinking, did somebody steal them when I was at the gym? You know, she's 99% sure she took them home, but there's 1% of her that's probably thinking, was there a thief involved? Were they stolen? That's the Mars ruling the 7th. Okay?
Yeah.
And the other thing she's thinking, just from the 12th part, is she's Venus, and Venus is approaching Mars. So she's thinking, am I going to get them back? Because Mars rules the 2nd. That's the possession. This is her, and she's moving toward Mars. Will I be able to conjoin Mars, which means I will come back in contact with those earbuds? So this is what's on her mind. The other thing we can see here, just from, is the sun is very close to both Venus and Mars. So there's a combustion going on here.
Yes.
And combustion means you cannot see those other planets. The sun is so bright you can't see what's going on there. So is there something to do with concealment or something being hidden from view going on here?
I think Mars as the 2nd lord in the 12th house combusts, and the ascendant lord approaching perfectly shows the situation as it is. Yeah.
And the other thing we can see is for Venus to conjoin Mars, it's going to have to leave Leo and enter Virgo. So whenever there's a change of sign in horary, there's often something has to change for this to happen. There has to be a change of circumstances in some way. All right, so that's what we can see so far. What else can we see? Oh, her treasure. So Saturn represents her treasure. Saturn is in Capricorn, which is very good, and it's in an angular house. That usually means she will get it back, especially since Saturn is retrograde. When the signifier of a missing thing is retrograde, it's going back. It's not going away from you, it's going back toward you. So that's often a sign that it will return. That makes sense?
Definitely. I see the trine, or Venus is approaching a trine with that.
Right. And the other thing here, in the whole sign chart, Saturn not only is the treasure, but it's her daughter.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a connection between the treasure she's trying to find and her daughter. And we know what the connection is. It belongs to her daughter.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So just from this overview and looking at the 12th part, we have a sense of what's on her mind and some of the possibilities. So she's looking for one of her possessions. Mm-hmm. She thinks she still has it. She thinks she took it home. It belongs to her daughter. And there's a nagging doubt in the back of her mind, maybe somebody stole it.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I was looking at the moon also, because moon is trining Mars, Saturn as well. And it's in the 8th house. So yeah, probably the transit of the moon would also be showing when certain things will come to
right. In Horary, the moon is really important. It represents the person who asked the question, for one thing.
Yeah.
It represents the question itself, and it shows the timing, how fast things and how they will progress. Mm-hmm. So if the moon is the person who asked the question, the moon will trine the Mars, meaning she'll get it back. If the moon is in the 8th house, which is another house of loss, so she's worried she lost it.
Yeah.
The moon, let's see. No, I guess this next aspect is to the Mars. So that's possibly she will get it back. Okay.
Yeah.
The other connection, we're going to talk about anti-scions, which are reflections in this axis, the 0 Capricorn, 0 Cancer. So the reflection of this almost 1 degree of Taurus would be about 29 degrees of Leo.
Yeah.
You can see it.
Mm-hmm.
So the moon, the anti-scion of the moon is right on top of Venus.
Yes.
And that's another indication that she may get it back, because the moon can represent things that wander symbolically. In general, it can mean fugitives, people who are running away or wandering, but it can represent lost objects. So there's indication she'll get this thing back.
I think it's also because it's the Lord of the 10th, and the 10th is the most visible. It also has that connotation. Yeah.
Right. So it will become visible again. Mm-hmm. And I think when we talked about anti-scions are another way planets can see each other. So we have the moon looking across and seeing Venus, Venus looking across and seeing the moon.
Since I've come across this and used this in my practice, the anti-scions and contra-anticia also has been revealing so much, so many connections that I didn't see, also in Prajna. So here it's also very, very clearly showing.
Right. So the chart is saying somehow Venus is going to see the moon, moon is going to see Venus. Venus represents the quadrant, and the moon could represent the missing object. So she will see it again. So let's move on. Oh, this is just a comment. So the Hellenistic and the Hindu texts tend to use the whole signs. The more classic Persian Arabic texts often use the Alcibiades house system. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the Porphyry, but I think more commonly the Alcibiades, which were the early house systems. And Lilly preferred the Regiomontanus because that was in vogue in his time. And also theoretically, there were reasons to use it. I think theoretically the reason was the Regiomontanus system is based on dividing the equator into equal segments. And the equator is a very mundane circle. It's a circle we measure primary directions on. And it has a lot to do with worldly activity because it's the central circle around the middle of the earth.
I think Regiomontanus, I know you use it. I don't think I use Campanus system myself, but I think both are really, they seem rationally sound,
In honor of the Persian astrologers, I chose Alcibiades. Partly I did that because I liked the Alcibiades. It really placed the Mars right at the 12th cusp, and I thought that was relevant. whereas the other systems had Mars more into the 11th house. And I thought that this was more descriptive and more consistent with the whole signs.
Oh, sure.
So, but it's very little difference. The only difference, I think, is the moon in the Regiomontanus was inside instead of near the cusp of the 8th, and Mars was inside the 11th instead of just inside the 12th. But I thought this was more descriptive because she was worried that the moon entering the 8th, that it would be lost and gone forever. It would be like dead to her, but it wasn't quite there yet. She was still looking for it. So I thought this was more descriptive. And so I think we settled this. Mars in the 12th, sorrow, loss, secret enemies. In Lily says the 12th is those who maliciously undermine their neighbors.
Yeah.
So this leaves credence that maybe there was a thief. Especially since Mars rules the 7th, which could be thieves. And if you remember the first slide, Mars was peregrine. Mars has no dignity in this chart.
I think also, moon, even though, moon in using Regiomontanus was in Taurus in the 8th, and the 8th is, of course, connected to that as well, thieves. But setting aside that, yeah.
Yeah. And Mars is without dignity. Planets without dignity can behave badly. They're sort of like delinquents. They can behave like delinquents.
And it's Mars also, like the cruel planet.
Right. And the other thing I noticed that Venus, Lily used this idea of besiegement. Generally, besiegement is between two malefics, but here, Venus is between the Sun and Mars. The Sun can act as a malefic at times.
Yeah.
And so something bad has happened to this woman. It's, she's caught between the Sun behind her and Mars in front of her. Two malefic, and the Sun is quite hot here. It's in Leo. So that this suggests that probably it was stolen, right? Because she's not in a good place. Right? She's caught between two malefics.
Yes, that's for sure. Yeah.
So
and Moon going to the 8th also, but the Moon is going to become really dignified as well. So
yeah,
the whole Saturn thing. So it shows stress, but at the same time we see there's also some positive stuff.
Right, and I think the Moon being dignified is a suggestion that she'll get it back.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we said all this. Ascendant is querent, second is her possessions, 4th is her treasure. The Moon can be fugitives and missing things. One thing I didn't mention is we were talking about anti-science before. The Moon is the anti-sign of Venus and vice versa, but Jupiter and Saturn are an anti-sign connection.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And
I agree.
Saturn rules the 5th of her daughter, and Jupiter rules the 6th of her daughter's possessions. So there's another way the chart is descriptive.
Right. All right. So
right. So Saturn is her daughter. Her daughter's goods are Jupiter, and so the missing item, which is Saturn, which is Jupiter.
Yes.
From the daughter's point of view, because it's the daughter's earbuds.
Yes, it's the 2nd from the 5th. Yeah.
Jupiter contacts Saturn through the anti-sign connection, so the daughter will see her earbuds again. Another argument there.
And also the South Node would be, referring to the 4th of the treasure. So it's also always a hidden thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And the South Node can mean you've lost something of material value.
Exactly. But also then again, that trine with the whole Ascendant Lord and so on also suggests that you'll get it back. So
let's see. We talked about the combustion. Here's Lily's definition or comment about combustion. When the ascendant ruler is combust, this means that the querent is in great fear and overpowered by some great person.
Yeah.
So it's a generalization. So, she's afraid she's lost him and she won't be able to give him back to her daughter, but maybe some other person is involved and has somehow overpowered her, which could be a thief, right? Sort of figuratively, not, literally it could be like an assault or a rape, being overpowered. But in this case, it's more like there's been some violence done to her, or she's been overpowered by somebody. And somebody who's probably masculine, because she's between Sun and Mars, which are two masculine, sort of robust adult males. Okay. Besieging, I mentioned before. Here's what Lily says about besieging. Placed between two malevolent planets. He gives the example, for example, Venus between Saturn and Mars. Venus is besieged by two infortunes, and it represents in questions. This is an interesting phrase: a man going out of God's blessing into the warm sunshine. I think he means by warm sunshine, like into the desert, into the hot sun. So you go out from God protecting you to you're on your own with the hot sun in the desert. That's his image here.
It's also, Venus is also entering its debilitation sign at the same time. So it's, serious stress on this.
Right. What's this? Oh, we usually look at the aspects the moon made before and after the question was asked. Because what happened before is the past, what happened in the future is what's coming up. Just before the chart, before the question, the moon had trine Venus. That's really good.
Yeah.
Then the moon shifted into Taurus. It went from Aries to Taurus, which is good for the moon because it's a sign of its exaltation. And the next aspect is the trine to Mars, which is her lost goods, suggesting probably she'll get it back. And the next thing that happens is Venus is going to go into Virgo. And but this sequence of aspects suggests that she's going to find it.
Venus is going to go into Virgo and then trine all that Saturn stuff.
Right, and Mercury's going to trine Jupiter, and then the moon is going to conjoin Uranus. Which is because the next aspect of the moon here is to the Mercury. Okay. We talked about the anti-scions. They're just reflections across the cardinal axis here. That's the image. I think I showed you the slide before.
Yeah, this is very helpful. Maybe I should say this. We made a video about Anticia and Contra Anticia, very extensive. It's like an hour or 90-minute video, and so all these graphs are there, thoroughly explaining this for people who are interested.
Right, and so in the slide we had the moon in Taurus looking at Mars in Leo.
Yeah.
So they're looking at each other. The daughter was Aquarius, and so she'd be looking at Jupiter in Scorpio. Okay. And we said this already. We talked about the anti-scions, the inside of Jupiter. In the daughter's possession is Neptune retrograde. So Neptune often represents some sort of deception. So something deceptive may have happened to this ring. I hadn't noticed that before.
It's also the sixth house. I mean, Jupiter is the sixth lord, which is also connected to enemies and all sorts of obstacles.
Right. Yeah. And it's a house of distress, and the woman's quite distressed about losing her daughter's earbuds.
Exactly. And squaring that whole ascendant lord stuff as well.
So here's the outcome. I mean, he told this is interesting. Let me read it. This is Ruben Meshikov speaking here. He said, I use the sixth house for the earbuds due to children. That's the second of the fifth. So Jupiter in the third, he said to her, could they be in your car? Reasonable speculation. Car, the third is local travel. After that, I saw the moon in the seventh, and the ruler of the seventh, Mars, being Peregrine, a testimony for theft and a thief. The ruler of the seventh was on the cusp of the 12th. Again, the 12th loss and people who work against your best interests. Many planets in the 11th house and Leo all suggest a gym. So he's connecting the sign Leo and all the planets in Leo in the 11th with gymnasium.
Yeah.
I guess because it's a public place
Yeah.
where people
Yeah.
can congregate. And masculine stuff, you've got the sun there in Leo.
Mm-hmm.
The moon will trine Mars, he said, which was not good. I think because he's thinking Mars is the thief, and so the moon, he think maybe that means the thief will get away with it. The moon going to a malefic, yeah, that's what he's thinking. I was not sure if she will get them back. Finally, I saw the anti-sign of the moon connected to Venus, and there was a pretty good chance she would get them back. I told her someone around 25 years old, a male, should have taken them. That's because Mars is the representative of the thief here. Mars is a young adult male.
Mm-hmm.
Guy who works out at the gym, very Martian. She contacted me a few hours later saying that on the camera, so here's the seeing,
Mm-hmm.
okay? They saw a male person of that age taking them. They found him and she got lucky. He was departing the next day abroad. So apparently somebody using the gym, maybe a tourist who stole them. Now, if we go back to the chart,
Mm-hmm.
the moon, interestingly, sees this Mars and Venus looking across. The moon is the 10th house ruler, which could be people in charge, the authorities, is looking. This guy, he's leaving abroad. Is there anything about leaving abroad? Oh,
he's in the 12th house, and he's the 7th.
Yeah, right. He's going abroad, right? So that was a great interpretation. He said he thinks they were stolen and looked for a man about 25 years old. So she went to the gym. She said, check your videotapes. And they look, and just as he said, this 25-year-old guy, they can see him stealing her earbuds, and she got them back before he left the country.
Wow, cool. That's a cool example.
Yeah. That also makes it kind of a really valid horary, because if she hadn't asked the horary, she wouldn't have asked them to check your videotapes, and they wouldn't have caught this. He would have left the country with her daughter's earbuds. The astrologer's intervention made a big difference here. Nice. I think the intervention partly from the besieging of Venus. She's between these two masculine malefic planets, and this guy rules the 7th, so he's probably the thief. And so he says, look for this guy, this Mars guy.
Because of course, Venus is approaching Mars also. Yeah. So there must have been someone there. And then in the 12th house of loss, he's not in good dignity either, right?
Mm-hmm, right.
In their Mars, in Vedic astrology, Mars is not considered doing well in Mercury signs, because in natural friendships, Mercury is inimical towards Mars. And there's a whole reason for it. If you look at the way these plants work inherently, they're what they are. It's just it creates a lot of problems, and but they caught him. I guess Saturn's strong, retrograde, angular trining that, and then also moon.
Here, the moon happened to rule the 10th, which is the people in charge of things, the authorities. And they look across, and with the trine, they catch up with him, and he has to give the goods back.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah.
I think she asked the question on the 21st, and this is like a day or two later, she gets it back.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really just as he thought it would happen, that he says, go look for this Mars guy, about 25 years old, and she goes to the gym, and I don't know whether she said to the manager of the gym, my astrologer told me.
Yeah, well.
My guess is she went and said, I think somebody stole my earbuds when I was working out. Can you check your videotapes?
If you look at, Libra, Aries, and then these two planets really approaching so close. I mean, they're in a very close yoga or aspect. It shows that there's another person involved. It's a first 7th thing. It's happening then very near the 12th house. I mean, it's the 11th, so in a social context. Then connecting that to this, masculine environments. The 12th house of loss, and then moon, adding the moon, always important. Adding the daughter, and then also the second and the fourth.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's certain steps you take. You look at certain houses and their rulers and how the rulers interact, and and there's an art to it.
If the question is honest, and also the astrologer is honest, then there's some kind of intimacy happening there, and so universe, or from the deep subconscious regions of our being, these things are allowed. You see, in Vedic astrology, it's called Deva Prashna. Like in astrology consultation, it's called Deva Prashna, which means something like consulting the gods. It's like a service also. If you can really help someone, then the gods will also allow for that to happen. And then because there's so much critique, of course, because these symbols can represent so many things and do represent so many things. So how can you make it like a science? But
I think I agree. The symbols can represent a lot of things. In Horary, it's really crucial to understand the question and the circumstances. So here, the fact that we're thinking a woman working out in the gym and the earbuds go missing, we have to fit that to the chart. The chart has to describe that. Exactly. And it's the daughter's earbuds. So that has to, so that's cluing us in. I was just noticing, again, the Neptune, I didn't pay attention to this, but the Jupiter, which is the daughter's earbuds, are square the Neptune, which was another suggestion that there was something devious going on. That Neptune is often a deceptive planet.
Exactly. Jupiter is also the lord of Neptune.
Right.
And it's squaring Venus and Mars there, right? In Vedic astrology, the 6th is enemies. The 8th is battles, and then the 12th is the result of the battle, which is also important. So I would always look at the 12th lord. I mean, besides the Horary example and applying these old techniques, look at the dispositor of the 12th, or the lord, the ruler of the 12th house, which here is Mercury. And Mercury is in the 11th house, which is in terms of gaining something.
Right.
It is the house of gains, getting something. It's in the sign of Leo, which is not a bad place for it, right? It would trine after some time. It's also trining Jupiter in third house there, exactly trining. It's 14. So that would also be important. And then Moon, of course, going to its exaltation sign as the 8th. Through the 8th house. So there's a lot of positivity to it, but I think it's the art is to really find out, and I think you have to know your planets, you have to know your the meanings also, and then apply it for I think Prashna or Horary is very good for learning what is really the concrete stuff about the planets and the signs. And as doing it a lot, also you get a lot of insight into what these signs and these planets can actually give. And it's like you mentioned, you have to read the question really thoroughly and understand the question, the situation, the context, to drive yourself into that space where you limit yourself in all these symbolisms and all these possibilities. And so in that sense, developing a skill for it.
Yeah, and the other thing is you get an answer, you're either right or wrong, and you know it fairly quickly.
Yeah, exactly. Well, maybe we can do some other example in the future. Maybe I have also some good examples. We can look at it together. Okay, so thank you very much, Anthony.
Okay.
Some other.
Great. Okay.